Thank you for auditing Professor Skye's Record Review, the always positive new music review show hosted by a French professor who spent more time than he would like to admit getting that drugstore skeleton just right. The drugstore skeleton is there because I'm going to be reviewing the album Dead Club by the British folktronica band Tunng, T-U-N-N-G. Now listen, I have never heard a Tunng album before. This is quite a first experience. I like the album quite a bit. And I've never really intentionally listened to anything that calls itself folktronica. I'm going to get to both things, both the band and the genre soon, but I want to spend more time with the theme that dominates this album, because this is a concept album, and that concept is death. Now, I talk about death a fair amount on this channel. I am drawn to it, as I've said several times on this channel. I wake up basically every single night at 2 a.m. and I think about not existing. I don't really think about dying, but I think about how much I enjoy existing and how much I would prefer not to stop existing. This album is dedicated in large part to fighting that kind of thinking. Now, my tendency, and this is what I've generally done on this channel, is whenever any question of death pops up or any question of existence pops up, I bring out some Jean-Paul Sartre and talk about Sartre, in particular his theories of existentialism, but that's not where this album is. This album, that was supposed to be less dramatic, this album is not actually an existentialist album. I think it goes way back further than that. I don't think it's so much about how death is inescapable and how that inescapableness can help shape our lives, and we need to fight the absurdity of that inescapable nature of death by bonding together in some form of solidarity. It's not really about that. I'm actually going to take this album much further back, and I'm going to rely on my formation as a professor of French. Now, I should say I am not an expert on any French philosophy. That is not what my specialty is. But when I had to study for my comprehensive exams, almost more than a decade ago now, I had to learn a lot. And in particular, I had to learn a lot about this guy, Montaigne. And I believe that Montaigne is the best philosophical companion to this album. Now, apparently there's like a whole podcast attached to this album and a fanzine and everything. I don't know. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in studying this music just as it is. And I'm particularly interested in showing the way that what this album does, the approach that it has towards death, is very similar to that of Montaigne. Fun picture of Monsieur Pain when he was 20 years old in Paris in front of a sculpture of Montaigne. Apparently my grandmother loved Montaigne as well, which is weird because she didn't love much and she was quite obsessed with death, which is what brings us to Montaigne and his changing opinions on death. What makes Montaigne's essays so interesting is that he has always said that he is the subject of his own work. And throughout the texts, he has one attitude towards death, and that attitude morphs by the end of the book. And this album, by Tunng, appears to encapsulate both, with a heavy emphasis on the more lighthearted approach to death that comes at the end of his life. So in the beginning, right? In the beginning, Montaigne very clearly says, and I guess he's probably quoting Cicero, he's very clearly saying, to philosophize is to learn to die. This is very much sort of in the Stoic tradition, maybe like Epictetus or other Stoics, who think of this way about death, that that's the beginning of learning how to be a philosopher, is learning how to die. Your last day is, I'm quoting here, Tiens pour ton dernier jour, chaque jour qui luit, pour toi tu baigneras la faveur de l'heure inespérée. It is uncertain where death waits for us, so you must wait for it everywhere. This kind of bleak outlook on death, the idea that death is everything in our life, is the belief that he had in the beginning. And it's part of the belief that he would overcome and that this album fights against. The whole reason I thought of Montaigne in the first place is there's many sections in the Tunng album in which people come on and just speak and say their opinions of death. In this album, someone says, they say to die is to learn to philosophize. Do you see how that's an inversion? The Stoic philosophy of early Montaigne is to philosophize is to learn to die. Well, here it's the other way around. That essentially there's nothing to fear from death, and therefore nothing to fear from anything. We see this acceptance in Montaigne in his later books, in his later entries into his essays, especially in the third book. Philosophers can talk about this as much as they like. But death, and this is very confusing French, est bien le bout, mais non pas pour autant le but de la vie. The words in French are almost the same, bout et but. It is the end of life, not the goal of life. By the time Montaigne had reached a more mature age, he realized that we must not spend all of our time thinking about death, that death is merely the end. C'est sa fin, son extrémité, non pas pour autant son objet. It is its end, its extremity, but not its object. So what Montaigne goes on to explain is that death itself, and this is heard all the way throughout the Tunng album, okay? All the way, all over the place on this album is this kind of theory, that death itself is a momentary moment. As Montaigne says, 15 minutes of suffering, passively, without consequence, without hurt. We should not think about it a lot. In reality, what he says, we are preparing against the preparations for death. We are not preparing for death, we are preparing for the preparations of death. So in this album, we see this inversion where it very clearly states both positions. The idea that death is the object of life is brought up, but it's almost always undercut by this more expansive, and it's actually a whole different school of philosophy, much more in the Epicurean school of philosophy, which is how Montaigne had changed. I think back to college, my great professor, Professor Gallagher, he explained this all to me when I was 19, and I had no idea what death was. I didn't think about it at all. I guess my grandmother had just died, the one who liked Montaigne. But still, and she, by the way, was very much in the mode of the Stoic mode. Her whole life was dedicated to dying, not dedicated to living. But what I learned in that class, and what I learned through this, is this Epicurean belief that every minute is both the end and the beginning of something. And that you can't really judge a life until it's absolutely over, and every moment is all that we have. I mean, the cheesy expression that's often used is carpe diem, to seize the moment, but it's much more than that. It's that the moment is the only thing that really matters. We don't have to worry about the afterlife, we don't have to worry about death, we don't have to worry about dying, we just have to live and not prepare for death our entire life. I guess in this way, it's very similar to Lucretius, who I did a little bit of extra research for this class today, for this video today. It turns out Lucretius is the main person that Montaigne went to learn about how to have this other perspective on death. And what's amazing is right in this first song, okay, the very first song of the album, Eating the Dead, Tunng is more or less paraphrasing all the things I just told you. They say, we don't experience our own dying. Death is other people's death. It is grief and loss. And that is the framing to understand the whole album. To die is to learn to philosophize. You get wisdom. The inversion of the Stoic values, the embracing of the Epicurean values, is what is at the heart of the third book of Montaigne and this album by the British folktronica group Tunng. Is that how you pronounce it with the two N's? Do you just call them Tunng or do you call them Tunng? I think I'll call them Tunng. It's more fun that way. So let's actually get into the music now that I've given this basic outline, and we'll see how these beliefs, these Montaigne-esque beliefs, are filtered all the way throughout the album. This approach to death, that we must stop preparing to prepare to die. I'm going to play you just a little bit of this album, just this song, the first track here, Eating the Dead, because it's as good of an example of what this folktronica thing is. Basically, as far as I can tell, folktronica is just folk music with a little bit of electronic elements. But I'm thinking, realistically, all music from here on out, for the last 20 years, should have onica added at the end. Heavy metal onica, okay? Rap onica, because the dominance of electronic music and the electronic modes of making music cannot be understated. If any music is not onica, it is purely affect. The ability to introduce all these different sounds is so readily available. I think that folktronica is just kind of a fake idea. But still, what we'll hear is a nice mixture of the electronic and the acoustic, the synthetic and the organic, which I suppose is what defines this folktronica, and it works really well, in particular with a band that is as heady and smart and trying to say something as grand as this album. So I'm going to play you just a little section of the song Eating the Dead. And in this song, you're going to hear the way in which there's this kind of bizarre backwards sounding guitar, maybe like a drum machine, some like, I think there's a clarinet in there maybe, and then people singing in this beautiful almost chant, almost like a death chant, and then mixed in you'll have people just talking and sharing their ideas about death. Here is Eating the Dead by Tunng.
Your heart and eyes and mouth.
You hear that clarinet?
Every word you spoke to me.
You know, just beautiful, haunting, and then here the guy's going to come in and start.
As they say, to learn to die is to learn to philosophize. That is, you get wisdom from the fact that you realize that.
So already, just on the first track, you understand you are like in for an absolute ride. Not in for a ride, you're in for a book. You're in for like a whole hour of really thinking deeply about these themes of death. It's a sweet, haunting album. Now, I read the review from the Financial Times, which is my father's favorite newspaper for reasons I don't always understand. It's a good newspaper, but he's not particularly into finances. It's just a good newspaper. Apparently, the chords in this song are D-E-A-D. Which seems like kind of a goofy, funny thing to do, but I think it works because it still manages to have that kind of feeling. Now, according to the things I've read about this album online, it's not just a record. It's a podcast, it's a discussion, it's poetry, it's short stories. According to the band's singer, it's about tackling the untouchable subject of grief, loss, and the act of dying. I want to say this album does not need any podcasts. It doesn't need any reviews. It exists as its own. And even just one song, you feel as though you've been through something. You feel as though you have read books 1 and 3 of Montaigne, at least those sections. Okay, moving on to track number 2. It's going to go a little bit quicker from this point. Death is the New Sex. This is very much continuing that Epicurean tone of the first song, like about the nature that death is always coming, and there's this weird, like, unsettling sounds going on, these synthesizers going, they get kind of distorted. The vocals remind me almost of Traffic. This very British accent. It's very thick all the way throughout, which is nice. And I'm not actually sure what it means. Death is the new sex. It's coming to F us all. I suppose it's just about the inevitability of death. In that way, it kind of goes close to that more sort of stoic mindset of death. But then the outro is just beautiful. It's just guitar and harmonies. There's tons of beautiful singing on this album, especially the interplay between the female vocalist and the male vocalist. I assume there's just one of each. Then we get to SDC, which stands for Swedish Death Cleaning, which apparently is some kind, I had to look it up because I never heard of it, Dorstanding, which is something they do in Sweden where they basically clean up and remove things that you don't need anymore in your life. And that's cool. That's an interesting idea. It's anathema to me because I'm a toy collector. Like, I'm a collector. I collect everything. I have boxes and boxes and boxes of things that mean something to me and mean nothing to anybody else. But it's an interesting idea in the whole theme of this album that, again, preparing to die as a way of simplifying your life. All the old toys in the shed have got to go. Again, not something I really agree with because I had to buy sheds just to put all my toys in. It's kind of funny because they also reference a dildo, and it's just kind of a funny specific thing. That's what made me understand that the cover, there's 12 songs on the album, and each one of these represents a moment in each of the songs. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So you can actually see it right there in the image. This kind of weird, almost like a tarot card style image. The next track is called Three Birds, not to be confused with Oi, 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 oi by Bob Marley. This one almost has an Angela Badalamenti intro with like these like nice plucked violins. There's a whole musical theme in here of like things feeling like they're in rounds, like almost like old English folk songs, or like ashes to ashes, we all fall down, or even row, row, row your boat. Like sort of like lots of nice dynamics with things sort of starting. And this song has like this guitar that's plucked in a circular pattern, and then the violin is plucked in a circular pattern. It all feels like different circles going on at the same time, with these terrible lyrics about losing 3 boys in the flood. Both singers are going on here. At times, the whole thing reminds me of like old folk tunes, and I don't mean like Pete Seeger. I mean like old British folk songs that you might hear 200 years ago. And maybe that makes sense because a lot of old folk songs, like Ashes to Ashes, were dedicated to death because there were so few ways of understanding death. In general, there's like this general atmosphere of like menace and sadness and a frank acceptance of death. Then leads on to A Million Colors, spelled the British way with a U, a very upbeat song. And what's nice is that this album is playful. It really is. I mean, you see it in the cover with the dildo. You just see it in general. It's a very playful album about death. And it's funny because we're in the middle of a pandemic and hundreds of thousands of people are dying all over the world. And that's part of what I like about it, is that it's about death, but it's really about life. And that's what Montaigne was figured out how to do eventually, what the Epicureans were able to do eventually, is realize that the only purpose in focusing on death is to live a better life. That's the only function. And not like a more moral life, but just live a better life for the moment. So this kind of upbeat song isn't out of place, even though the entire album is about death. It has like a great drum machine mixed in with claps, so you have the synthetic and the organic. Folktronica! Piano comes in very kind of discreetly. What's nice, the drums are always like very separate. Everything here feels kind of modular, and these voices coming in. And then the theme, I can see the world continue on without me. That's literally what I think about at 2 o'clock in the morning when I wake up and have my existential crisis. But there's this beautiful chorus. It's the highlight of the, musically, the highlight of the album is the chorus to A Million Colors. Both singers are together. It rhythmically sort of almost falls apart, but stays together. And just great usage of the second vocalist, and just a very uplifting and deep and dark and meaningful chorus. The melody just goes over and over and over again, and it basically creates something like polyrhythm. Like that's what good rounds can do, is they create something of a polyrhythm. And this is very circular. If I had to say another thing about this album, is it feels very circular. Maybe that has to do with this larger theme of our atoms, disappearing and going into creation and the eternal cycle of life. I'm not sure. There's an outro there, which I believe, based on what I read, is from the singer from Tunng, which I reviewed a while ago, a great album. So he's speaking French with a fairly strong accent, just kind of continues on these themes about what is death. Then we get to the song Carry You. And much like the first song we heard, if I had to get one adjective for this album, it's sort of sweet. It's a very sweet album, all the way throughout. It's very kind. And even though it's about death, it's never morbid. I don't know how to work with that. I don't know how to work with something that is both kind, that is both morbid, that is both obsessed with death and kind at the same time, but there you go. At times this album reminds me of Robert Wyatt's album from 2007, Comic Opera, which is one of the best albums of this century. It could just be the strong accent and just the sort of wise take on life. Like somebody who is wise and talking to you about life, but without seeming too preachy. Very cool guitar and synthesizers mixing together here, chimes and actual bells. There's all kinds of instrumentation happening here. And another song that sounds like a traditional British folk song. Everywhere we go, we will carry you. It's a beautiful theme. The Last Day has this female voice opens it up and starts talking. And then her aspirating becomes a part of the sample of the rest of the song. It's really quite nice. And this song's interesting because it seems to be really playing with this theme of early Montaigne, of the Stoic concept of death. This could be your last day, right? And so how do you deal with that fact that this could be my last day on planet Earth? I could die today, and you could die today, right? So what do we do with that fact, right? And in the early days, in the Stoic mindset, you have to wait for it everywhere, look for it everywhere. But here, instead, it's more that every day is the last day of your life, so just live it as though it was the first, as the last. Almost the fact that it could be the last day of your life makes it less meaningful. That just do everything that you would normally do because you have no control over it. And it's just over and over again repeating this theme. This could really be the last day of your life. And a weird kind of lowered pitch of the this could really be, which reminded me of 21 Pilots, ironically. I don't think there's an influence there, but the way the 21 Pilots will take like a certain line and lower it reminded me of that. Tsunami, I think, is the low point on the album, but maybe just because it made me think of that movie with Ewan McGregor. Do you remember that movie? It was about the tsunami, and Ewan McGregor was in it, and maybe Tia Leone? No, Rachel Weisz. It was just this really sad movie about, whenever I think of tsunami, I think of that movie, and I think of the death, and I think it's terrible. Beautiful vocals though, like kind of like the piano's kind of plonking, female vocalist on this one, very gentle, very vulnerable. At times also this band reminds me a lot of the Mekons, but that could just be because they sound very British, and there's a male and a female vocalist, and they play around with folk music, and they have interesting instrumentation. Okay, that's not that superficial of a similarity. I think that, like, I have a friend who's a mega fan of the Mekons, and I'm going to tell him, hey, check out Tunng. Man is a tough one. I have a hard time fitting this into the philosophical outlook on this album. It's cool, it's the most folksy sounding, the way the guitar is played, but it's all about, like, the actual last days of someone's life, about fentanyl patches, about palliative care. And it's sort of too concrete, I think. Like, it's too concrete, too many details about someone's actual death on their actual deathbed. To me, it took it out of this kind of philosophical realm, and it reminded me too much of being at my mom's side in palliative care, right? I didn't, for the most part, this album doesn't make me think about people who actually died. It makes me think about death. Whereas this feels like it was designed to make me think about people who actually died. But it does have a larger theme, which is interesting, that they ask a series of questions. You know, did he look happy? Yes. Did he look younger? Yes. Did it feel as though his soul left? No. It's just the same bloke, just he's dead. So there is a very firm anti-afterlife theme to this album, which you could argue is at the heart of the Epicurean take on death seen in Montaigne, right? That we just have to live for the moment, and that's it. And as they say at some point else on the album, when you die, it's lights out. And that's it. And so tonight, when I have this crisis that I have every night, I'm going to try to think about this, you know? Because you don't know you're dead. You might know you're dying, but you don't know you're dead. It's just a light is out. So why even worry about it? And why is there a perfectly enjoyable, excellently produced, catchy, enjoyable album all about that doesn't bum me out? It makes me happy. That's why, because Tunng is really good. By the way, if you're a Tunng fan, could you please put in the comments where I should go next with their music? Because this is just great. What a great band. So that's Man. And then we get to the song Scared to Death, which is the most earnest song. I mean, the whole album at times has the feeling of kind of knowing, almost, not quite sarcasm, but maybe a layer of irony to it. This is just these great, very catchy, bloopy synthesizers with clean singing, strings and piano. Life is the strangest light, and just keeps on singing over and over again. I'm scared to death. These great, slightly distorted drums come in, which remind me of like a John Lennon solo album. The sound of the drums there, it's a very specific kind of drum sound he often used. And at the end, the voice becomes so clear. Just, oh, I'm scared to death. Just saying it over and over and over again. And obviously, I think this is trying to be playing with this preposition to. It's not really scared to death, it's he's scared of death, but it's just about this fear, and it's another very good, frank confrontation with death, with the drugstore skeleton that awaits us all. Fatally Human is basically the thesis of the album, that humanity itself is fatal, that to be human is to be in a fatal position. That the second we're born, we're dying, that kind of thing. And it continues on the earnestness of the last track. And I really enjoy there being this kind of earnestness. I think it's necessary to the album. I think if we didn't have these two songs that seemed a lot more just straight on exactly how they feel, it wouldn't be as good. The last song reminded me of John Lennon. This song reminds me a lot of the Beatles, especially the way the strings come in and the drums come in at the end, and even like weird like tape loop sounds of people talking. And it made me think that, you know, if the Beatles were not around now, they probably would be somewhere on the folktronica spectrum. Because the whole thing about electronic music is it just makes creative people have more access to more sounds. So all good music from here on out is going to be onica in some way. Because anyone who's like super against that and defines themselves by a rejection of readily available cheap technology, is relying on affect. So, anyways, the future is Annika. And I don't mean Annika, a girl I went to college with. Same college where I took that class about Montaigne. The track ends with a song called Woman, which is this is very similar to, so woman and man are similar in the way that they are very concrete. But this is better though, because this is basically about an archaeological approach to a human being. Okay, so they're looking at a woman who they call kata, and all about the way that you can read what someone's life was like by staring at their bones, by seeing what was around them, by seeing the manner in which they were buried. And it starts off over and over again. Someone might read your body like a book. And it's true, and even probable. If your body still exists in 10,000 years, someone will probably read it. They will read my bones to see that I ate a lot of tofu, that I didn't drink, that I didn't smoke, but that I had asthma. I don't know what they'll be able to tell by looking at my bones, but still. And it goes even deeper to talk about her husband, and they kind of like extemporize that her husband was kind of a bad guy, but he was okay, and just talking about all these things that they could read, and then talking about the way the particles that made up their body are now inhabiting the people who are looking at them at that exact moment. Like I said, is very circular. This is really much that theme. It's very circular as well because this ending kind of matches the beginning, because the first track, Eat the Dead, has very much this feeling like you're looking at an autopsy, like a combination between an autopsy and a buffet. Like, I'm going to eat your memory, I'm going to eat your eyes, I'm going to eat your face, and I'm going to eat your memories and everything that you are. And then this last song is really about like how you can see everything from the dead body that they lived, and how those particles are going to go on to live in other people. The whole thing really has that great circular feeling. And the one thing they said was, one thing we know is Kata had little thoughts all the time. And I think that's very much a reference to all of us, that we all have little thoughts all the time. So there it is. There's my review of Tunng and their album Presents Dead Club. I think we're all a member of the Dead Club. I think that's part of the idea. And I think that we have nothing to fear from death. Thanks, Tunng and Montaigne and Lucretius. This is important stuff. Okay, well, for Lucretius and Montaigne, and let's face it, you know what my grandmother said to me, by the way? This is true. When I was like 8, my grandmother sat me down. It's the first conversation I remember having with her, and she said, "Skye, I'm going to be dying soon, so it's not worth me getting to know you." It's really what she said, and she was right. 14 years later, she did die. Oh well, I ended up going to the same college as her, and I ended up loving Montaigne the way she did. But I liked all of it. Okay, until next time, there's the camera.